Psyche, this is on?
Yes, you're on.
All right, cool, great, fantastic. Good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to another Friends for Life's Not a Straight Thing installments. Tonight, we will be talking about homophobia, internalized homophobia, and how it is driven by gender-based violence. We have some esteemed panelists. We have a lineup of doctors. We have Dr. Angelique Nixon. Dr. Nixon is a Bahamian-born but Trinidadian-based queer writer, artist, scholar, and activist. She's a lecturer and researcher at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. Angelique is also the director of the feminist LGBTI civil rights organization, HISO, Sex and Gender Justice in Trinidad and Tobago. She's an author of the poetry and art chapbook, Stalwart Healing, a myth, memoir, and poems, and the award-winning scholarly book titled Resisting Paradise, Tourism, Diaspora, and Sexuality in the Caribbean. Good night, Dr. Nixon. Also on the panel, we have Dr. Nikoli Attai. Dr. Attai is a research associate and program coordinator for the Queer and Trans Research Lab at the University of Toronto. That's the Marks Bonham Center for Sexuality and Diversity Studies. He is also a postdoctoral fellow in the Women and Gender Studies at the University of Toronto, Canada. That was a mouthful. Dr. Katija Khan is also joining us. Dr. Khan is a psychologist, clinician, and academic. She's based at the University of the West Indies at St. Augustine in Trinidad, where she's a lecturer in clinical psychology in the Faculty of Medical Sciences. She also coordinates the Master's Clinical Psychology program. She's also a member of the Executive Council of the Caribbean Alliance of the National Psychology Association. Did I get that right, Dr. Khan? Those words did not roll off my tongue. The Caribbean Alliance of National Psychology Associations. That's it. Yeah. In the past, Dr. Khan was the president of the Trinidad and Tobago Association of Psychologists. Good evening, Dr. Khan. Good evening, panelists. And good evening to our audience, all of you waiting on the Zoom. So I would like to start, as I was saying, we're talking this evening about how homophobia and internalized homophobia is impacted by gender-based violence. And so I wanted to give the panelists a chance to talk about their work either with gender-based violence or with LGBTQI issues. And so we'll start off with Dr. Nixon. Can you tell us a little bit about your work?
Yes. Thank you so much. And I will try to add a spotlight. Okay, so we're both on the screen. Great. Well, as all of you know, we've worked at Friends for Life, KAISO, the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, Silver Lining Foundation, Womantra, I Am One, and a number of other informal partners, LGBTI organizations in Trinidad and Tobago, partnered for 4 years on a project that I think we should all be very proud of called A Sexual Culture of Justice. And we were really building and cultivating our capacity and partnerships to work on ending gender-based violence as well as LGBTI discrimination. And so our work for the last 4 years together, the project has ended. It was funded by the European Union. But one of the things that I worked on with Friends for Life, I was project lead of that project, and we continue. We had 18 activities over the course of 4 years. We had 6 partners and 6 other informal partners. So it was a very broad activity-based human rights project in which we really focused on how do we work to transform our approaches to gender-based violence, and how do we also transform approaches to LGBTI discrimination and violence. And one of the activities that we did, I mean, we did many, but I want to highlight the one that we did with Friends for Life. Luke and I were the co-designers of a project activity called Life Stories, where we wanted to privilege the stories, the experiences, the knowledge coming from community members, in particular working class LGBTQI plus people living in Trinidad and Tobago. And we collected 18 life stories over the course of the project. We analyzed those. We collected qualitative data that ended up really feeding into the work of the LGBTI policy agenda that we put out, that prioritized the needs of LGBTQI plus people living in Trinidad and Tobago, and particularly focusing on working class needs and the ideas that people had about how we can transform and create change. And as Luke would know, and we worked on this together, one of the things that came out of that project is, and the life stories, is that so many of our community members experienced severe, and we were even shocked, even, you know, Luke's been doing this with 2 decades now. Friends for Life has been engaging with community members, and in my work with KAISO, we've worked for the last decade on doing this work as well with other LGBTI organizations. And so working with community members, we know the levels of violence, but I think we were still very, we were even surprised at how much came in the life stories. And we noticed through our qualitative analysis that every person interviewed who shared their stories with us experienced family violence as teenagers, as children, a lack of acceptance, a lack of social support, but also we found really important stories about chosen family and creating social systems and support. We also saw that there were very high rates of gender-based violence, intimate partner violence as adults, into adulthood, and even public forms of violence that we know are particularly troublesome for people who are gender non-conforming and for trans people. And so we were so struck by this and the impacts of gender-based violence and the levels at which we saw people in the community struggling with internalized homophobia, internalized issues of hate and harm that come from the outside. We were really struck by that. And so a lot of our work in the project, we wanted to make sure that by collecting this data, we were able then to have the support and the evidence, local evidence, to support the calls for change and our policy advocacy. And this lined up really, really importantly with other aspects of the project, which one of them was led by Silver Lining Foundation to collect quantitative research in our secondary schools on the levels of gender-based violence and gender-based bullying. And so these 2 studies, in particular for sexual culture of justice, really illustrate one, we wanted to make sure we had locally produced data and have local knowledge products to show why we need to do this work. And then in the process of that, we created really important intervention strategies around gender-based violence, doing trainings, creating toolkits, working with teachers, making interventions with police, and interventions with family. And so that's where I want to highlight that work. And so everything that, I mean, just me personally in my research and in my activism, I have been working on issues of gender-based violence for a really long time. And I think it's so important that when we talk about gender-based violence, we must include LGBTI violence. We have to talk about the ways that sexism, homophobia, queerphobia, and transphobia intersect, and how they also function with classism, racism, and other issues related to discrimination and marginalization. So I will stop there.
Yeah, thanks for kind of highlighting those intersections as well. I think we really can't underscore that even appreciating this notion of gender-based violence, including LGBTQ violence, and that we have this understanding that it's not just one line, but it's rather kind of many roads that cross. So Dr. Khan, I want to invite you, secondly, to kind of talk a little bit about your work in the field of gender-based violence, and if you have done some work with LGBTQ issues as well, you can kind of bring those to light.
Yes, so thank you, Luke. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to spend a Friday evening with you. I can't wait I wish I could be in person, but this will suffice for now. And especially since we have people from all over the Caribbean joining us, this is the best way for us to do that. As a clinician, as a clinical psychologist, gender-based violence is something that I encounter, and both as it extends to my academic work related to that as well. One of the projects I'm currently working on right now with the School of Nursing is developing GBV curriculum for healthcare professionals. So it's something we're really excited about, because then we get to tackle this. And as Dr. Nixon was pointing out, all of these different other factors that come into play and make it very pertinent. And it's a curriculum that's been developed for our local setting, our local context. So that way we get to factor in all of these cultural issues that impinge on gender-based violence. So I'm also a member of the board for Silver Lining Foundation, Dr. Nixon mentioned as well. So very pleased about the work that they're doing. So with the school climate survey and so a lot of my LGBT advocacy work and clinical work, a lot of that is done through Silver Lining Foundation. So I was a part of the Stronger Families Project, which was a part of the Sexual Culture of Justice Project. And we ran an initial 3 cycles of that, where we facilitated a support group, and also we also offered one-on-one therapy for members of the community. SLF is also the recipient of a CAISO Australia grant, and we're excited about that as well. There are different components to what we're doing with that. One of them is to also offer some of that psychotherapeutic, psychosocial support to the LGBT community, as well as we're going to be developing a peer support program. So we're really excited about that. As an ally, I think it's important to have different voices that contribute to this topic. And so as an ally, I choose to lend my voice to that, because I think we need all the voices to speak up and to contribute. I think issues, and I agree that we cannot talk about gender-based violence without talking about some of the groups that are most vulnerable and most affected in our society, and that includes the LGBT community. And even within the LGBT community, we have other groups that are even further stigmatized and prejudiced. Just today, I did something I said I will not ever do, which is start a debate on social media. Never works out, never works out. But somebody, put an article up, and they were talking about issues of different kinds of abuse, but they juxtaposed it with an adolescent who was struggling with their gender identity and who was coming out, who said they were transgender, and the juxtaposition was done in a very stigmatizing and prejudicial way. And I felt, when we see these things, we need to speak up, even if it's on social media, which is a tricky terrain to do that. But just to say that I think it's important for us to have these conversations, and these conversations need to happen in all sectors of our society. Every corner, we need to shed some light and start talking about this more. So thanks again for the invitation, and I really look forward to the discussion.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. And bringing up the rear, we have Dr. Attai. Sorry, oh gosh, I know you so well, according to Dr. Attai. Could you just talk a little bit about the work that you've been doing? Kind of how we appreciate LGBT issues as gender-based violence issues.
Yeah, so thanks as well for the invitation, Luke. I'm always excited to, engage with folks back in the Caribbean, and I'm happy to see we have some folks on the Caribbean. I saw Renee from Barbados, who knows my journey doing this kind of work. Cyrus, who I'm still collaborating with, doing some work in Trinidad. So as you know, I've been involved with Friends for Life, CAISO, AJD over the last few years, also working on these similar projects. And in my academic work, I'm really interested in thinking about how LGBTQ plus people negotiate this violence, negotiate homophobia, transphobia, discrimination, gender-based violence, and so forth. And I'm really, I've done research in Trinidad, Barbados, Guyana, Jamaica, and is really interesting to see how persons negotiate violence on the ground level, on the ground. So in my work, I'm really interested in the moments that we can look at to really think about what violence looks like in varied contexts. And again, how people make sense of this violence, how people live with this violence. I've been doing a lot of work with working class trans women in their communities, in the rum shops, trans women who do sex work. And it's really interesting to see how people co-opt and negotiate urban space, night space, and these spaces, and the kinds of things we can learn from them. And, you know, and everyone has said it so far, we can't disassociate gender-based violence from LGBTQ issues. It's so ingrained in, you know, all aspects of the society. I think immediately of one trans woman from East Trinidad who I've been in touch with, who I've collected life stories from, and the kinds of stories she talked about facing gender-based violence on various levels, on state-sanctioned transphobia in the community, in her small little town in East Trinidad. I won't call the area, but it's really interesting to see how she makes sense of it, how she understands the ways that she is also deeply, you know, kind of ingrained in the system, but how she is able to make life. I'm really interested in this idea of making life. How do we, and how do LGBTQ plus communities in the Caribbean and Trinidad and Tobago make life in the face of this kind of violence? It's not only about violence. And I'm really interested in focusing on what else, and how we could use these moments to make sense and to understand the violence, and how could this inform the kind of policy advocacy work we've been doing with the groups and so forth. So, and again, I really look forward to our conversation this evening.
Okay, great. And I wanted to kind of focus very specifically on this notion of internalized homophobia, and kind of what that does to the psyche of a person. And the reason why I want to focus on this tonight is that just looking back, even this year, there was the murder of Anthony Singh, and just in the past few years, how we've been experiencing these murders of gay men and trans women, and where the impetus comes from that causes that, and also how do we end up in situations that are so unsafe. And so I'm going to jump in by asking first, in my experience is that sometimes when we have these internalized notions of how bad we are, and how shameful we are, and how much we're a bad person, that we end up moving in the shadows almost. We end up in situations that really put us in danger, because we put ourselves in situations that get victimized, because we don't want to tell anyone, we don't want to be out, we don't tell our parents, we don't tell our friends sometimes where we're going. But all of that is because sometimes there is a bit of a shame. And I know that people do that for safety reasons as well. But I want to talk about this notion of internalized homophobia. And so I wanted to go to you, Dr. Khan. Could you help us unpack kind of what your experiences are of persons who feel this intense hatred for self, and kind of how that shows up in different areas in their life?
Sure. First, let me start off. I know we all have a sense of it, but let me just talk a little bit about what are we calling internalized homophobia, rather how it develops, and taking that psychological perspective. So we start off in society, and from very early on, even long before we have a sense of our own sexuality, we get this message from society that heterosexuality is normal and anything else that doesn't conform is abnormal. And so, as I said, long before we have our own sense of our sexuality, we internalize those feelings that heterosexuality is normal, everything else is bad and abnormal. So then when you start to recognize your own non-gender conforming, non-sexual orientation conforming self, it leads to this conflict, because that's not what was internalized. And so this conflict, people respond in different ways. So you have that internalized belief that what you are feeling is wrong or is bad. And a lot of people get stuck in that conflict. And even though if they express some of that internalized homophobia outwardly, it might get rewarded by people who support that dominant viewpoint. But inside, you know, it's not authentic. You know, it goes against the grain of who you genuinely are. And so that can take a really significant toll on your mental health as well. So what a lot of the research has shown is that internalized homophobia also comes with low self-esteem, feelings of guilt, lower levels of emotional stability, higher levels of sex guilt. And it's related to other things as well, depression, suicidal thoughts, etc. One of the ways of viewing it as well, and this is one of the classic psychological ways of viewing it, is if we take a psychoanalytical viewpoint, so as influenced by Freud. With internalized homophobia, what we are doing is, and one way of describing it is we are employing a defense mechanism in which we identify with the aggressor. What does that mean? You're identifying with the idea or the person who poses the threat. So the person who is homophobic, right? So the person who then you feel threatened by, but especially when that's the dominant view, then you might also feel that you cannot overcome it, you can't master it. So therefore you succumb. You succumb and you identify with that viewpoint. And then if you also look, I read it, this article, really, it made me really think about this. And I want to use the example of homosexual men or gay men. Growing up, your peer group is really important. So a lot of times, the persons of sexual interest may be other heterosexual males. So it may be members in your peer group, or just in general. At some point in time, you have those romantic feelings for a heterosexual male. But if the viewpoint you're getting from these heterosexual males is a negative one, that homosexuality is bad, what you're feeling is bad, then if you identify with the aggressor, or you identify with that dominant viewpoint, that's what you're going to identify with. And so you're going to internalize some of those feelings where what you do is bad, who you are is bad, who you are is negative, and it fuels, as I said, more of those negative mental health outcomes. So this is something that has both, we've seen in that interplay of the environment, so your socialization, what the messages society and culture are giving us, and also that personal psychological process. So people who are more at risk, if they don't have enough supportive and protective and affirming experiences, are going to be more at risk for something like internalized homophobia.
Right, right.
Shall I pause there?
And if I could just jump in quick, I mean, you know, it's important that we acknowledge that some of these institutions that play such an important part in our lives as we grow, in influencing how we approach and how we feel about sexuality and gender and identity and stuff. So religion, the family, you mentioned peer groups, school, and so forth, right? Like what the important roles that these institutions play, right? You know, the Caribbean being very religious, you know, these long colonial legacies that still influence how we approach and how we understand ourselves and how we relate to each other. And even I'm happy you brought up that whole point of like homosocial bonding and stuff as men grow, right? And what it means for us to know from day one without being told that, okay, this is wrong, this is and how we internalize that subconsciously without even knowing, right? Without even someone telling us necessarily that is wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dr. Nixon, I was kind of thinking also about how internalized homophobia causes you to lash out. Because I know that in some ways, people, when they feel that sense of shame, maybe they lash inwards but sometimes they lash out, and so then that then looks like violence against other persons who remind you of how you feel on the inside. Could you kind of expand on that a bit and let us know if in some of the social research that you were doing, if any of those things came up?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, one of your questions to us was to really think about how do we unpack the ways that gender-based violence, happens within LGBTQI plus communities as well. And we have to be able to talk about and acknowledge the fact that, in some of our relationships, like there's no guidebook, where we said there's no queer guidebook to how to be in relationships. And some of the same harmful gender roles that Nikoli and Katija are talking about that we learn very early on. We are gendered very, very early and socialized into our genders and this idea of masculinity and femininity. They are polar opposites, and they also have value systems where masculinity is more valued and it's attached to power, and whereas femininity is less valued and not attached to power. And of course, these things are racialized and complicated too, and classed. So we could get into that, but just to say that I think, how we just as we look at gender roles, and then getting into queer relationships, the power dynamics are different. And there's no real, guidebook to how we can be in relationships. Nobody's teaching us how to be in queer relationships. Nobody's teaching us how to love. And if as Dr. Khan is saying about self-love, and as we're unpacking about that internalized homophobia, internalized queer phobia, internalized transphobia, and also on top of that, misogyny, how do we, we hate on feminine things, anything that's feminine, female acting, female dress, you look feminine, you act feminine, you do this, you do that, especially if you're masculine or a boy or a man. If you're gendered male or man, you're expected to be quote unquote masculine and exert particular kinds of roles. And so I do think that impacts our intimate relationships. And, if we bring it all the way, as, Dr. Attai is saying about colonialism, and we have to situate the ways that gender-based violence and issues of economic violence impact our day-to-day. And, even, when we look deeply at our histories, we are carrying legacies of so much harm. We're carrying legacies of colonialism and violence through the systems and structures of slavery and indentureship and the long, long centuries of colonialism. And whether or not we might be conscious of it, I think it's there, and I think it impacts all of our relationships. And family violence, we heard again and again through the stories, right? Children who are being, beaten and told you have to act like this or be this way, and the kinds of violence that get enacted. I talk about it in my work that I grew up around all kinds of violence, and I'm not exceptional. I know we all have been, and violence is normalized. So what is then going to happen in the context of, the larger systems and structures that we're raised into, to hate ourselves for so many reasons? How then are we going to be able to be in intimate relationships? And I think for me and in my work, I talk about this so much, that we need healing. We need transformative healing, and we need to tackle the issues of gender-based violence, not as a singular issue, but as a whole of society issue, as something that impacts us daily and that is rooted in all of our systems. And so if we're going to change it, we have to do that hard work of paying attention to self, of thinking about how do we come up with community-based solutions to gender-based violence. And I think if we listen, even just listening to some of the stories, I know, you and I, Luke, when we looked over the transcripts and we heard some of the ways that our community members were able to figure out how to live and be resilient in the face of so many challenges. We saw that in chosen family. We saw it in recreating communities. We saw it in finding support systems. So we know that in the face of so much challenge, we know that, LGBTQ plus people, our folks be doing the most out of so little. And I think we have to acknowledge that and say, if we're going to look for resilience, we certainly are going to see it there, especially among working class LGBTQI plus people who are struggling, migrants, right? When we look and talk and really spend time and think about what sex workers, in particular migrant sex workers who are vulnerable because of the work that they do, because of sex and gender, because of how people see them and their migrant status, I say, that's where we're going to figure out those lessons. And we have to include these voices in the way that we think about change. And if we're going to make transformation, we have to include those most vulnerable and those most marginalized. And I have to say, finally, before before going back to you, Luke, that, our trans community right now, we are going through so much with the loss of Brandy, and I know we're going to have a moment of silence soon, but just to say, as Dr. Khan was saying, and I know Dr. Attai has done work on trans communities for a long time in Trinidad, that they are so vulnerable and experience so many levels of violence. And we have to think about that, how that is then connected to exactly what we are speaking about today.
Yeah, it totally gets you. Thank you, Angelique. And yes, we're going to get to that moment of silence. I love what you said about looking at it in the context of our intimate relationships. I'm kind of oldish, and back in our days, we used to have a phrase or a saying, and it was "beat man, make me feel real." But behind the context was that there had to be the strong masculine, uber masculine, almost to the point of toxic masculine kind of person to be the opposite for the gay man. That was the kind of relationship that we had to get into. And so kind of like what you were saying, where there was no playbook on how we were going to figure out relationships, and we tried to try and pair it on other things that we've seen, and how sometimes there can be this exaggerated kind of replaying of heteronormativity that we want to do in our relationships. That's something that just, it don't work for them. So I don't know why it would work for us. Dr. Khan, can you kind of share a little bit about how that plays off in relationships when one person, it's almost like when you're in an abusive relationship, but you're identifying with the abuser in a way that holds them up as a proper spouse.
Yeah, because I think the dynamics get quite dysfunctional, and so the beliefs about, or rather what you would accept, what is seen as normal, what gets reinforced, gets very twisted. So I spoke about that emotional instability before, and the emotional instability speaks about that ability to regulate your emotions, handle emotions, even sometimes to be aware and process your emotions. And that emotional instability is associated with more aggressive violence and more physical violence in relationships. And as you all have been pointing out, it's human nature for us to identify with the dominant power. One is the thing we're most exposed to, and also power is seen as the ideal. We want to be in the position of power, not in the position of not having any. And when that position of power reinforces things like control, or you're talking about some aspects of that toxic masculinity, about how that power is exerted, how we demonstrate it, how we leverage it in our intimate relationships, in our sexual relationships, then it can lead to a very distorted idea of what I'll accept or not accept. So if I am a victim of physical violence, sometimes we come up with these scripts on narrations to help you deal with that and help you survive with that. So for example, one of the theories that helps us understand why people stay in abusive relationships is learned helplessness. So you experience it, and especially initially, something is wrong. This is not what you want. This is not your idea of it. But it becomes difficult to escape for many reasons. Okay? And so you try to escape, or you try to avoid it, and that's met with, and you're not successful. Then after a while, you stop bothering to try. So when it happens, you just live with it. It happens again, and it becomes normalized. Because sometimes you hear about people's relationships, and even this is influence. You talk to adults and you hear about their childhood. You talk to teenagers and you hear about their childhood, and you hear how much normalized violence and aggression, the kind of punishment they were subject to we romanticize licks in the Caribbean. We do. So many, I think, smart, intelligent, well-read people will say, they need some good licks. Toronto is spoiled nowadays. And so what we have done is normalized violence as a means of supposedly regulating our discipline and behavior. So why is it that we would expect somebody, having grown up with that message, that licks is how we get people to behave and licks is good for you because that is what will get you in shape? Why do we expect them to do something different when they're adults? So the research has clearly shown that people who are exposed to more physical aggression and physical punishment in childhood exhibit more physical aggression in their relationships. That's not rocket science. It's not a surprise.
Yeah.
It makes lots of sense. And so it then becomes harder because now that you've gotten accustomed to these dysfunctional ways, how do we refine that? And when we add in all of the other factors. So with that learned helplessness, you start to just accept it as a norm because you cannot see a way out of it. And it will protect some of the status quo. I saw a comment in the chat about, how let me just see if I could access it there, that some of that, this stigma is still there in terms of, they say one of the oldest isms, we have so many isms, we're talking about heterosexism here too, but one of the oldest isms is still sexism, where people think anything perceived as feminine or womanly is submissive, so nobody wants that. So for me to be the opposite, I have to dominate, even if it means through physical violence.
Yeah. I kind of was reflecting on my own life, because I had my own time when I think I had these internalized ideologies, ideas about homophobia that I was ascribing to. And then later on in my life, I began to, and so I would hide, like you try to pass as heterosexual. And I started to go through a phase when I didn't want to pass at all. And it's weird now because I'm back in, even in my older years, not necessarily trying to pass, but I'm very muted and understated in my gayness. And mostly it's because I just want to be safe. Oh gosh, I don't want people to yell at me in the road. Just yesterday, some vagrant cussed me out because I didn't give him $1. But the cuss out have to include the bullerman and the faggots and hand them and all of them. So Nikoli, I wanted you to, I know that because of your work with trans people, Dr. Attai, you must correct me when I keep calling you by your first name. I know that, so yeah, I wanted to kind of talk about your work with trans people and how is it that sometimes what might seem like if, I hate myself and so I'm diminishing my own presence or space in the world actually is strategies for surviving and how we can look at them as such.
Oh yeah, I like how you phrase that because a lot of times it may be positioned as being helpless or being seen as less than. It feels really weird. Could you come back on the screen, Luke? It feels really weird speaking to myself. It's been a long day, sorry. Yeah, so but in my research, I'm immediately thinking of some interactions I've had with trans women in ARIMA who are expected to assume this position because they're trans, they're sex workers, they're living in the rum shop. And we know the rum shop is hyper-masculine, very misogynistic, very toxic. And they're assumed by a lot of people to be positioned in a particular way within a rum shop space. But there are ways I see them negotiating the space to claim agency through sex, through the ways they negotiate with the men. So be it if some men or even other women see it as entertainment or whatnot, but they've been able to use these spaces and these interactions to claim agency and to, I guess, turn that whole misogyny and hyper-masculinity on its head. Not because, and one person would always say, not because I is a dress-up girl, that mean I can't handle my stories, right? So it was really interesting to see the ways that they negotiated the space. So could you remind me again what else? Sorry, my brain is a bit foggy this evening.
I was just talking about how sometimes what seems like if you are kind of, diminishing yourself or that it looks like if oh, you don't have self-esteem, but really what it is strategies of protecting yourself. So you know what spaces are dangerous and you know how to protect yourself.
Yes, for sure. And if you speak to any girl, any woman who's on the street, there's so much we can learn from them. They know how to negotiate space and how to negotiate these things, right? If you speak to any of the girls behind, what was formerly known as Hilo in Curep, I mean, I think that there's Massey up in the back street there, right? If you speak to any of these girls or you see them in action, you see how they are able to navigate these spaces, right? While, kind of laying low in the background. So there's so much we can learn, and it's kind of going back to what Angelique was saying earlier about how much we can learn from these communities, these working class communities. And this is the kind of things that need to really inform the kind of policy work and the advocacy work that groups do, right? So that it's really connected to the true experiences of those who are most vulnerable.
Okay. Yeah. And so I want to invite persons who are listening on the Zoom. You can drop, if you have some questions for the panelists, or if you want to make a comment, you can drop those in the chat. If you are listening to us live on Facebook, there's somebody I think monitoring that. You can leave a question there as well. And so while people are kind of thinking through the questions and coming up with comments they want to make, I want to go back to the devastating loss that we felt in the community yesterday when the news came that stalwart activist, house mother Brandy Rodriguez had passed away, and how the outpouring that I saw on Facebook just kind of letting me see, even only by just, you put that thing up on Facebook where it's you and the person, and to see how many lives that she's touched. Like, I mean, it's just amazing. And so I wanted us, if you feel so comfortable, to share a little bit about your experience with Brandy. I will start by sharing mine first. Brandy was one of the first she's not one of the first trans women. We used to do this thing called a condom run, and we used to end the condom run in El Dorado. And so the trans people would come out and line there. Some of them would be doing sex work, but then some of them would just be there because that's where the safety was. And I remember one time we got down, I'm talking to Brandy, and this car pulls up, and all 4 doors open, and 5 men run out of the car. They're running, coming to me in our direction. And this guy pulls a knife, but it looks like half of a machete out of his pocket. And so he's running into us. And I'm just thinking, that knife is so long, that's gonna go in and come out the back of me. And while he's running in, then I see Brandy come running past me, going out with 2 huge boulders in her hand. And she starts to curse and make a scene and tell them, I'll mash up your windscreen, so on, whatever. And then, so the guys go and they get back in the car and they say, no, it's not that one, it's not that one. But I remember how terrified I was. I remember how remarkably brave Brandy was. And I also remember when the car pulled off, Brandy dropped the stones and turned around and started talking to me like nothing had happened. That's my story. I need to call your interns, and Nikoli, you want to go next?
I could jump in quickly. So I first met Brandy when Matthew died. I had just come back to Trinidad, with a little inquisitive self. I heard that Matthew died, so I was like, well, I go into the wake in Arima, and got to the wake, we're lying by this little bar, and I just see this person run out of this big wig. Some men passing like, hey, I fucking bala, man. And Brandy come out again, probably had a stone, and run out in the road for the men, right? And that was my first encounter with Brandy. But then even I've been in conversation with Brandy over the last, 10 years, just about like their experience, but also the experiences of working class trans women, who are sex workers, migrants in the last few years. And really seeing the kind of care that Brandy exhibits for these communities. You could go to Brandy's house in Curep anytime. You're sure you're getting some fried chicken, you're getting some good pong. But there was this space, right, that was always open to anyone in the community, right? Those are two really profound moments that stand out for me, for Brandy. And, you know, I just keep thinking, you know, when you say death, like such an untimely death, like there's so much more I knew Brandy wanted to do, and so much more that she could do. And this huge gap that we now have to fill, right? But I'm really, as you say, I'm really happy that we have all these good memories of the fierce Brandy, who would continue to keep us safe.
Dr. Khan, did you ever have any interaction with Brandy?
Yes, very much so. A few years ago, she and I met when we were both doing an interview for Pride at the time. And then, so we were in Port of Spain, and afterwards I said, well, where are you off to next? And she said she was heading home. I said, well, I'll give you a lift. So we talked all the way in the car, and we got to Curab, a park up outside the house, and we continued talking some more. She was saying, I have some people I needed to talk to. And that started a process. So whenever there was somebody from the trans community she felt would benefit from talking to a psychologist, she would call me up. I would tell her, give them the number. And over the years, I would see many of the persons she referred to me, whether they were going through distress, a lot of them, whether they were considering transitioning, etc. And we also interacted in many other different fora, so whether it's a panel discussion or some event, etc., or paths crossed often. And two of the things we were working on recently, we had met and she convened as a number of stakeholders, family planning, she got a doctor from the US. We were talking about working on setting up some best practice guidelines locally for the transgender community about these are the different medical professionals who are involved, these are the different steps that are involved, and these are the people who are endorsed by the Trans Coalition who are safe to go to. Because of course there's a lot of cowboy unethical stuff going out there, people, a lot of misinformation. And a few weeks ago, she called me and she said, Dr. Khan, I have somebody I needed to speak to. And I said, Brandy, oh my gosh, I was about to call you because we just got some funding to offer therapy for the community. And I wanted to let you know that we're devoting a specific number of those sessions to the community. And she was so excited. And she said, right, I have 2 names for you now. And she sent me the information and she said, but I'm going to hold on. She asked me how long it was going to run for. I said, we have a few months, so you don't need to give me all the names now. She said, okay, I'm going to hold on. And when I have somebody else, I'm going to message you. So she was truly an amazing woman and a powerhouse. And it was an honor to work with her. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Nixon.
Oh, sorry. Oh, Katija, you got me already crying. I actually met Brandy my first year that I moved here, and it was through a research key population study. I think it was UN Women and IGDS was involved, and you know, she talked about her work with people living with HIV, and her and I had some conversations, and we both were kind of critical of, okay, you all are coming to do more testing, like what's happening here? And so we both ended up having these side conversations. And then from there, over the years, my work with KAISO, and when Brandy founded Transgender Coalition, you know, of course, Trans Coalition became a part of the Alliance for Justice and Diversity and became a very close partner of Sexual Cultural Justice Project. And most recently when the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdown hit, you know, Brandy reached out and said, you know, I ended up talking to her and she was like, this is what's going on with community. And I was like, well, let's do something. And we acted very quickly. You know, the same thing that Nikoli was talking about. You know, her house was the center. We got donations. Marcus went into full gear. Nikoli went into full gear. Luke, we all just found support. We wanted to make sure that trans folks and queer folks and sex workers were supported. And we were able to do that work for about 6 months where we got different kinds of donations. And I just want to say that Brandy worked tirelessly for people who are vulnerable. And that's how I remember her, to be a fierce champion of human rights. And, even when stuff was unpopular, she was still, very fierce. And, you could quarrel with Brandy. We had lots of quarrels, and we could disagree. But then the point was, how can we support it? And I'd always say to Brandy, no matter what's going on, if folks need support, however we can help, I would try to activate. And, Brandy would call, oh, this is what's going on. I'm like, okay, let's do this, and that's how, I think up to the very last, we just, with Dr. Khan and I, and with Brandy's support, and Ray, Luke, you were involved, we created a whole healthcare training based on Brandy's insistence that we have to think about how we're training healthcare workers to deal with sex and gender diversity. And we did that just in January, and so, yeah, she was such a force. And yeah, it's hard to think about. That's also such a shock,
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. And I mean, that was an incredibly sobering moment. But I just wanted to kind of pull myself back and collect. As I was asking persons to make comments not to make comments, to post questions in the chat, and somebody made a comment that this notion of shaming, oh gosh, right, so internalized homophobia is also connected to this notion of how bottom shaming in the community. So when persons, the passive partner, we ascribe certain things to them, and they aren't allowed to have certain experiences within the relationship, but also how we kind of shame other gay men for being bottoms. Like, I don't know what else you're supposed to do. But I mean, I'm not putting this on you, Nikoli, only because I saw you shaking your head real hard. But is it any kind of different across there in Canada? Like, does this still kind of persist in the way that we experience it in the Caribbean?
Well, definitely. I think the whole idea of bottom shaming is so connected to femininity, and as femininity as an inferior positionality, right? So there's the act of being the one who receives. And again, based on this internalized homophobia and internalized misogyny and all these things, the LGBTQ plus community isn't immune to that, right? And we see it all the time, right? Effeminate men are more at risk of violence as they move through space, in accessing state services and walking the street, being bottled, as you know, as in terms of like your experience. And other men, like more masculine men, more straight passing men, are able to have safety in ways that effeminate men can't. And that's all because masculine men probably also internalize these notions, right? And subconsciously benefit from it as well, right? Perform a type of masculinity that's eligible to the dominant norms and values in the society. So for sure, even out here, it's the same thing. I think across the Caribbean, we see it happening across various communities, and even in lesbian communities as well, right? Like lesbian women who are more masculine are also prone to different types of violence as opposed to lesbian women who are more feminine, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna jump in and say that exactly, because if we're playing out the same sexist really roles, and that what we call like homonormativity, you see that a lot in like the research on sexuality studies, that we see how a kind of normative approach to relationships and to how gender roles, if you reinforce that and you become as close to heterosexuals and the norm as possible, even if you're gay, then you're okay. But the minute that you blur those boundaries, or you're gender queer, or you're trans, or you're gender nonconforming, or you're a woman and very masculine, or a man and very feminine, if you're blurring any of those lines, then we're police all the time. Like you were saying, Luke, about how you felt like you had to act. And I think all of us at one point in our lives felt that way. I mean, growing up, you're constantly told that, as girls, constantly told, you shouldn't go outside and play. You can't wear that. You can't look that way. You can't play rough. You can't play with the boys. It's a constant telling you. And if you don't, then you get licks, right? As Katija is saying, if you don't act right, you don't perform your gender role properly, and you're not behaving, then you also, get punished. And the punishment might not always be physical. It could also be mental, right? You could be, and then that affects your self-esteem. It affects, how you then show up in relationships. And then who is rewarded? What kinds of relationships are rewarded and accepted in society? Are you the right kind of gay? I think you see that a lot now. It's like, are you the respectable gay, or are you the not respectable gay? And I think that's the thing we have to challenge. We have to show up in all of our complex, beautiful, genderqueer, and fuck up the system, because it doesn't work. If it doesn't work for heterosexuals, obviously, and it's not going to work for us either,
Dr. Nixon, you're going to get me bleeped on YouTube.
Bleep it. No, but I mean, and even in the LGBTQ plus communities, you see the same thing happen, same kind of policing happening, right? Are you the right kind of top? Are you the right kind of bottom? Are you the right kind of trans woman? The right kind of trans man? And again, yeah, like we're not immune, right? Going back to that comment about the bottom shaming, because even power bottoms are shamed as well. Like big man like you bend over taking dick, right? Sorry to be so crass, right? But we see how this kind of policing is so toxic across so many levels, right? And how do we really address that? How do we come to terms with this kind of policing and really start to have these kinds of conversations to let people know, hey, you could do it how you want it, right?
And to your point, Nikoli, and I think, Katija, you were bringing this up with the comprehensive sex education, and I know all of our organizations and so many activists have been fighting for comprehensive sex education, because the research shows, and we know it in our work, that when we empower young people and we talk about sexuality and we talk about gender and we teach young people about, well, what is gender-based violence? How does it affect you? We know that it prevents all of the problems that we then identify later on. It prevents child sexual abuse. It prevents teenage pregnancy. It prevents, gender-based violence later on. Like when we teach young people about their bodies, about consent, I think that's one of the things that we have, and we continue to unify on that point, right? As we call for other kinds of change, but that kind of transformative change and demanding of our leaders and government to not be so fearful, of it. Abstinence, abstinence has not worked, and not talking about sexuality in schools has not prevented there from being a whole bunch of, the spectrum. We LGBTQI people exist, we're here, and we didn't go anywhere because we didn't talk about it. And also people are still having sex. So I think, those are the things that I struggle with. And I wonder how best we can get those messages across and, show. We have so much evidence to show that this is what we need. These are the kinds of changes we need. And I think that is how we begin to create transformation. And, finally, our spaces, Silver Lining Foundation is doing such great work. CAISO, we have our homeless and justice program where we're really offering services and really fighting against discrimination. So if folks are experiencing anything, we ask you to come to us. Nikoli's been working with us for a long time, and Friends for Life, long established, over 23 years now, or 24 years of providing social services and support for our communities. That's why we're here. And we also are guided by folks like, come and join us and help us do this work and create the change that we need.
Dr. Khan, did you want to say something?
No, but a thought was running through my head about how we have come to view gender-based violence and same-sex relationships differently from different genders. Because I think it evokes a different reaction when we hear about a man beating a woman. We think, oh my gosh, there's something inherently unfair about that, the powerful and the vulnerable. But I think when it occurs in same-sex relationships, and we do know that same-sex relationships at higher risk for intimate partner violence, but how it's perceived in a different way. And I recall quite distinctly, Nikoli, when we were on Mona together, I remember there was an incident on Hall and Bacchanal, and there was a lesbian couple, and we heard how they had one rock down, roll on fight. And I remember that we did not, it was more about the Bacchanal and the sus and the gossip. And at no point did we think, because if this story were different, if the narrative were different, and we had heard about a guy beating up on a girl, we would have immediately wanted to, the response would have been different. But I remember distinctly, because it was two women, we did not even see the violence there. We did not have seen as somebody needs some help, they need to talk to somebody. It was more just about the, I don't know if you remember that.
Vaguely. But I think even an incident like that is not even like, because Bacchanal takes over, not even understanding the kinds of power dynamics that influence a situation like that, right? That compels one partner to be violent towards another because they probably assume a particular role in the relationship, not only in the bed, but in the relationship, right? So, but again, like in our Caribbean societies, we love a bacchanal, we love a drama, especially when it comes to these kinds of, as the brothers in Trinidad say, the good pull down panty scandal, right? We love a good pull down panty scandal. So, but without even really understanding all that's really going on in terms of the kind of gender dynamics within relationships that are very similar to the gender dynamics in heterosexual and heteronormative relationships, right?
Yeah. And don't, I mean, also, it is the case that LGBTQI people, we're already seen as hypersexual and more violent. Like there's something already by the way that we are, the stereotypes and the assumptions people make. Oh, what they do, what happened into that, you know, that the assumption is that there is already going to be drama because it's quote unquote not natural, right? This idea that we are constantly fighting against and constantly having to speak back to and speak against. You know, so and so then also if you do show up and try to get social services or to get assistance, your situation is not taken seriously. And so we heard a lot in the life stories of queer folks and, you know, lesbian, gay, trans, bi, trying to go and saying, you know, something happened, they didn't even want to go. Like even the idea of going to the police, people said, no, why am I going to go? They're not going to take me seriously. They're not even going to, you know, so the same thing that, you know, we hear women go through in heterosexual relationships that they don't want to go and report. I think that's more underreporting actually in queer relationships and same-sex relationships because of the very same issue. Not going to be believed, the stigma attached to it. And as you were saying earlier, Dr. Khan, about all of the reasons why people might stay, you know, it's also those fears, oh, no one's going to believe me. It's some of the same things. And if your relationship is already not accepted in the broader society, then what is going to happen if you're having those challenges? And so who are you going to tell? You know, I mean, I think that's also the struggle. And, you know, those are the spaces that we need to create for healing and for people to come within communities to figure out how do we work out our issues, how do we figure out spaces of healing so that we can, you know, so we can support each other.
Yeah, and as you said, spaces of healing, I just want to big up Cyrus. I see he posted a really profound comment there, a reflection about Brandy, but I just want to big up Cyrus and even the space that Bohemia has been, and, you know, was over the years as a space of healing, doing the kind of work that a lot of us aren't able to do for persons who the youth have been, persons who have been rendered homeless, persons who needed somewhere to rest their heads, persons who needed somewhere to party, to just, and Cyrus, I just want to, you know, just say thank you for also being that person in our community who continues to provide the space of healing for us, right? You know, and you know, just thank you for that.
So we're coming up on time, and I really wanted to keep it as close as possible to an hour. You know, young people these days can't take too much chunks of information. And so I wanted to kind of maybe do a rounds and wrap up. And although I know that I really wanted to take some bites and to chew up this concept of internalized homophobia, you can talk about that if you want, or you could kind of, you know, bring out a point that you thought was not fully fleshed out, and you can kind of do that in a round click. So I'll call you as you go so that it doesn't have too much lag time. And so we're gonna go to Nikoli first. Nikoli, you're to my left.
Good. Yeah, I mean, I will really just want to close by saying internalized homophobia affects all of us. We all internalize not only homophobia, but we internalize so much. And it's really important for us to be aware of or to get to a place where we could really, understand how we are affected by these things that we internalize, right? Like gender roles, stereotypes, homophobia, transphobia. Even though we may be members of this community or allies, there are ways that things we internalize affect the community, affect others around us. And I will just encourage us to be more aware of that and let that inform how we engage with each other, engage with people, and move forward.
Okay, great, thanks. Dr. Nixon?
Yeah, I just want to close by saying I want us to be kinder to each other. I really do. And I think as so many of us on this call are activists, we wear many roles, we have many hats in the community. And I just really want us to be kinder to each other and think about how empathy can drive our work. And so that means, creating, again, thinking about how we create spaces for healing, but also encouraging members of our, all the folks that we're doing work with. Let's see how we can come together and best support ourselves and, acknowledge that all of these outside forces are affecting us. And, acknowledge the ways that power might work differently. And how do we, talk about our relationships? Maybe we need to create more spaces where we say, these are the struggles that I'm having in relationships. And I want to give a shout out to Wholeness and Justice, our KAISO program that is doing different kinds of work like this. We have something called a living room. If you're interested, please check out KAISO, KAISO.org, KAISOTT.org on the web. Check us on the socials. We want to create more spaces for community, and we want to be led by community members. So what are the things you need? Get psychosocial support if you need it. Look for the free services, shouting out to Silver Lining Foundation for those services as well. And, join us in this struggle. And so all of the folks on the call tonight, and as you listen to this, support the work. Friends for Life has been doing such amazing, ensuring that we have community-based research. And that's why we're so happy to join forces with Friends for Life. And we are going to have articles that come out, as well as very clear publications that you can have open access to that can support our work.
Dr. Khan?
Thank you, Luke. I just wanted to reinforce how important an authentic existence is for psychological well-being and for preserving our mental health. And that internalized homophobia is a threat to that. And that when we see it and we encounter it, we also need to extend some empathy. The person is not yet in a place where they can, hopefully they're on that journey to achieving that authentic existence. And perhaps we could see how it could be supported. Other than that, we know that gender-based violence is such a huge threat. It's a public health threat, a social threat, economic, psychological, medical, just on all fronts. And so conversations like these are important. We need to continue to have them. We need to continue to interrogate all the different levels, psychologically, personally, interpersonally, societally, nationally, regionally, etc. What can we do more of? And finally, I just want to commend everybody who's here today, who chose to spend your Friday evening like this. May you continue to be sustained and emboldened to continue the amazing work that many of you are doing. And hopefully there's something that you got from today's discussion that helps encourage you, motivate you to continue on that path. Thanks, Luke.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And so just my own experiences of moving from a space of feeling that shame to being somebody who is now trying to live their authentic self, as Dr. Khan says. I know for certain that living your authentic self gives you the best feeling in the world. And one of the things that have always realized is that for LGBT persons, when we demand space, people just make space for us. You see, they count on us. They want us to be afraid. They really do. And so when we act afraid, somehow that gives them justification. But if we claim space, they get confused, and confused so much so that they step back and give us space. So this program would not have been made possible without the support of CDC, that's the Caribbean Vulnerable Communities Coalition. Their headquarters are across in Jamaica, but they have programs across the Caribbean. They have a paralegal program, and the Friends Life has a community paralegal who is sponsored by them, Terry Ann. So go to our Facebook page, go to our Instagram. It's all over the place. Just look for Friends for Life and connect to the paralegal program. And so thank you to my panelists for joining us. You all were fantastic in helping me flesh out this idea that I had in my head that was kind of weighing on me. And thank you so much for all of you all who joined this evening, as Dr. Khan said, on this wonderful Friday evening when you could have been anywhere else. So thank you and good night.